What's up, YouTubers? So I've been editing a ton of videos and, well, shooting videos. So it's probably not the smartest thing for me to do another video without even uploading or finishing the 20 or so other ones I've done, but whatever, hey. I have a viewer of mine that said that his 6011 welds are kind of looking pretty rough, and he wishes that they would look better, and he doesn't like the spatter and all that, and I hear you on that. So I thought I would do a video kind of to help him out. So since he was talking about the spatter issue, I want to bring up a couple good points. One, make sure you have a good set of gloves. Now, these things I've had for multiple years now, and you can tell, man, these things are pretty much cashed out. And in a video I have coming out soon, I ended up having a molten ball of, I think it was hard facing, drip off of something and literally burned through this, through the Nomex layer inside, and almost melt my thumb. I'm okay, like I don't even have any injury there, so that's good. But these things I think are worse for wear. They need to be cashed out. Now, I'll still use them, but for future videos, I'll probably end up wearing these. I just bought them. I have really big hands, so I'm not sure how well these are going to work. I mean, they fit okay. I've always used those Hobart ones over there, so this is something new. The reason I bring this up is because when you're talking about 6011, 6010 spatter, having cuffs that come back and cover this area is huge, because as that spatter hits this, it's not going to burn your clothes. And just so you guys see, from this video I did, because I don't really care about this hoodie, I mean, combination of 7018 and 6010 here, I mean, just massive holes. Well, had I been wearing a little bit longer of a cuff, would have helped out a lot. The other thing is, these things are cheap. It's an FR sleeve. Had I slipped this on all the way up my sleeve, and they're fairly comfortable. I mean, this is a little tight, but all that spatter wouldn't have done anything to my clothes. Now, I don't really have any nice clothes, to be honest with you guys, so I don't really care if I wreck like this hoodie. I mean, this isn't my going out hoodie. Not that I even go out or have a nice hoodie anyways, but you get the idea. So having a little bit better protection like this stuff will help you guys a lot, especially with your 6011. But let's get into kind of fine-tuning that 6011 rod so you have a little bit more success. All right, so my viewer struggling a little bit with the 6011 rod. So we're only going to be dealing with this 3/32 6011 today. Now, he didn't mention if he's using 3/32 rods or 1/8 inch rods. So I'm not quite sure on that, and being that it's starting to get late, I figure if I responded to him, I wouldn't get a response in time to shoot this video anyway. So we're just gonna use 3/32. Now, I can tell you that with 1/4 inch plate, you're much better off using 1/8 inch rods or 5/32 rods. What you're gonna find is, yeah, you can use this little rod and weld 1/4, no problem. But your travel speed is going to be so slow to deposit a decent enough weld that what ends up happening is you're feeding, 1.5, 1 3/4 times as much rod per inch of weld, which means that everything, you have to be very steady, you have to feed a ton of rod in, etc., just to get a properly sized weld, so equal in width and height. Well, guess what? If you're starting out with 6011 or you're fairly new to welding, what's your enemy? Well, it's having to feed a ton of rod in and being very slow and meticulous and exact on your movements. Like, that's the arch enemy of everyone who's learning to stick weld. So using these small rods makes your life a lot harder than what it should be on 1/4 inch plates. So my recommendation is start with 1/8 inch 6011, and for 7018 you can do 3/32, but definitely with this 6011 start with 1/8 inch. Now again, I'm not using that today, but I can weld with this, so it's not really a big deal. Okay, with that said, I also want to mention 6011 to me runs, and it's not just 6011, 6010 is the same way, tends to run inconsistent. I find that however you start the rod, and the first ½ inch of your weld is going to be how half this rod is going to burn. So if your start is like cold and not good, and you really crammed it in there and you didn't long arc it at the start a little bit, then your whole weld is going to weld like that, or the whole rod about halfway will weld like that. And then once you get to the halfway point and beyond, it starts welding different generally. And that's just the nature of this rod, and I find that with 6010 too. These rods have a fair amount of moisture in them, in the flux when they're made. I'm not exactly sure, but my guess is that once you weld about half of this rod, this part of the rod got so hot, or at least hotter, that any moisture in this flux started to bake out, and that might have something to do with why it welds different. I don't really know, hard to say, but I can tell you that you really need to focus on having a good clean start and get the puddle the proper width with this rod, because if you don't, it's going to be very difficult to reestablish and get that looking better halfway through a weld. It's just, it doesn't work like that. So I'll give you some tips on how to start, and we'll actually do some welding. Now, a 6011 is the same as 6010 for me. I find that if you try and strike the arc down on, say, the edge of this plate, just like that, and then you keep this rod crammed in there and then just weld like you would with a 7018, I find that it makes a stupidly narrow weld. It doesn't wet out, and like, you almost can't fix it. Like, you'll end up trying to get to here and you try and long arc it to get it to spread it out, and it just, at that point, you almost get arc blow. It just doesn't weld good that way. So my trick is, personally, either I'll go ahead of it a little bit, strike the arc, bring it back, or if I strike it on the edge, I strike it and bring it up slightly. So not up here, you know, slightly up. The arc cone comes out wider. It will flatten that initial weld pool out, and then I drag it with a slight long arc and then bring it back closer to the plate. Now, my welder has arc force settings. Your welder may have it as well. As you recall in my previous videos, the arc force is the tighter you cram the rod in it, the higher the amperage is. So in the case of 6011, you can run a high arc force setting, and that will help you out a lot, because as you push the rod in to dig out, say, below the surface for more penetration, it won't stick the rod. Now, if your welder doesn't have adjustable arc force, I will be honest, that's going to make it a little bit harder to run 6011. When you have adjustable arc force, you can tailor the arc and the molten puddle kind of to how you want it. And that's one of the things, like my reader was talking about, how he doesn't really like 6011 and probably doesn't like 6010 either that much, and the beads look bad. And it's, yeah, sure, some of it might be just a skill level issue. However, if he's using a no frills, bare bones welder, it's not going to be as good as it could be, I guess. So anyways, again, you strike the arc, you long arc it slightly just to get the puddle to flatten out, you bring it down, and then I use a stitch motion where I kind of rock the rod down into the plate up, just like this. If you run this rod straight in with the same arc gap and never bring it up, your weld is going to be pretty much look like a bead on caulk on the plate. You want to use that arc force to flatten that bead out like this. You can also, if you saw in my 6010 video, 6011 runs the same. You can bring it up, push it down, up, same thing, and that will help you. And the last thing I'll say before we actually do some welding here, 6011 and 6010 are humbler rods. And what I mean by that is, if you do not have very consistent travel speed and arc gap and manipulation, your weld's gonna look like trash. I mean, it's just that simple. If you have consistent travel speed, consistent, movement in your hands, and you keep that arc gap consistent, your weld, you're gonna be rewarded with a good looking weld. And that's something I talk about a lot, like your 70-18, 70-24, even 70-14 rods. The molten puddle solidifies so slowly that the molten metal has time to like self-level, okay? This rod in particular, along with 60-10, solidifies so fast that it captures like a thumbprint of your consistency as a welder. So if you're not happy with how your weld looks with 60-11, but your 70-18 is looking good, then that's telling you you need to work on your consistency. And a good way to do that, I'm just going to hold this rod in my hand and I'm going to manipulate it like I'm welding all the way down, and I'm going to hold it just off the plate. Okay, and mind you, I'm looking at this through a camera. This is, if you can do this, and I'm going pretty slow, I'm keeping it just above the plate, okay, you will be able to weld with this rod. It wouldn't hurt just to practice this and try and keep it just forward and back, or you can do a little stitch, a little rock, just like that. And try not to touch the plate like I just did there all the way down. That will help you. And also try and make straight lines holding it just above the plate, just like this. The last thing I'll mention, I promise, it's hard for me to do this as well, so, you know, when I tell you this, trust me, I understand it's hard. I get, you know, bad anxiety sometimes, and I get what I call a death grip, where like I'm holding onto the stinger so hard that I can't manipulate my wrist, and if I don't acknowledge or notice it, all of a sudden I'll try and weld around a corner or something, and I'm like locked up, and then I'm telling myself to relax. One of the things you have to get used to when you hold your stinger is just picture it like loosely in your hand. And let me zoom out here. I generally grab it down here at a weird angle where I'm grabbing part of the cord. It just works better for me because I can tell myself to relax to where this is just kind of in there, okay? If you choke up on here and death grip it, you cannot manipulate this the way you need. I also commonly will grab this like this and just loosely hold it and let it rest in my hand. And the looser your grip is, the more you can manipulate it. Like, see how easy that is? Versus, like, you can hear my wrist popping, how difficult this is. Okay, so you want to be relaxed. And if you find yourself grabbing this sucker like you're gonna, like it owes you money, just relax. Just relax. Try and hold it with just your two fingers and just manipulate it that way. Like, trust me, if you can relax, it will help your weld. All right, let's do some actual welding now. So you guys know this is a 4-inch wide plate. So you can follow along with me if you use a 4-inch plate, or you can use whatever size you want. I'm going to calculate out what my travel speed is so that you guys can maybe videotape yourself and determine if you're running faster or slower than me. Now, this is a 332 6011, and I'm running it at 70 amps. I think that's going to be a little bit on the cold side, but for a first pass, that's fine. You can see how I'm holding this pretty loosely in my hand. All right, so travel speed in metric. The weld is 10.16 centimeters long, which equated to 3.444 seconds per centimeter or 0.29 centimeters per second. And standard 4-inch long weld, 8.75 seconds per inch or 0.114 inch per second. So around an 1/8 inch of weld per second. Hopefully that helps you out timing it. You can figure if you're going to run a 4-inch measured weld with 6011, anything faster than 8.75 seconds per inch, or a total weld time of about 35 seconds for a 4-inch weld, you're moving too fast. So burned up a little bit more than half the rod actually to make that weld, as you can see here. Yeah, definitely more than half the rod. My travel speed, start to finish, fairly consistent. Now, you can see there's all this flux on here, which brings up a really good point. And I'm gonna go grab my grinder. With 6011 and 6010, I'm telling you guys, like, listen to this. Use a wire wheel and clean your weld completely clean. When you use a chipping hammer and a brush, and I'm going to show you that. You can sit here all day with this. This does help because it's, if you look at it, it's, well, pretty worse for wear. It comes to a point. Now this is pretty clean. There's still a ton of slag, like look at that in the toes. You see, you guys see all of that? You don't want that in there. The grinder will help you clean that out way faster and way better than doing it by hand. Now let's look at it. See how much cleaner that is? Now there's still slag on the toes there. You see that? 6011 has the same problem as 6010. If you just weld right over that with 7018 on the toe line, you'll end up getting what's called wagon tracks. So not that your welds are going to be x-rayed necessarily, but if you don't burn that out of there, you can end up like your x-ray literally shows like like train tracks, okay? The best way to take care of that is either with a sharpened chisel, just run it down this way, or you can use the point. Got a lot of it out. There's still a little bit, but this side's looking real good. Kind of hard to do that. Well, but these gloves are very slippery, but you get the idea. Now this weld isn't the straightest weld. I'm welding on this without a line. It makes sense to score a line on this so you have something to work to, but that's all right. So now the next thing is we're going to run another pass right next to it to where we're overlapping. If you recall in another video I shot dealing with how to stick weld, you want to aim this rod to where you're literally depositing the weld directly on the toe. If your rod is back over here, it's never going to carry over to here, and you're going to get a peak in a valley where this is going to be low, and then you're going to have the peak of the weld here. We're going to run this rod literally right there to where the edge of the weld should hit the middle of that. I'll also mention real quick, this is kind of humped up, so it's a little cold. This rod should definitely, I'd say 80 amps would be a little bit better, but that's all right because this plate will start getting pretty hot. So I'm going to aim for this rod right on a toe line. I'm going to have a drag angle, obviously, and I'm going to be pushing it that way. That ran pretty good. You can see this rod is starting to get pretty hot. And I find that they run different near the, I guess, the last third than they do the first. like 2/3. Not bad. Definitely not a 70/18. Now you can see this is a little bit inconsistent. See how it necked down and then it got wider? Every little movement, whether you go too fast, too slow, too much arc gap, too little, is all captured by the 60/11 rod, just like 60/10. So now that you kind of have a little bit better idea on my hand position and everything, let's actually look at some arc footage and I'll shoot some to help you guys out. So this weld is going to be run real consistent. You can see the molten puddle at the start. I long arced it a little bit to get it to wet out, and I just ran it smooth the whole way. You can see my travel speed moving forward is pretty slow, like I'm not rushing it. I'll give you play-by-play here. So the start here, I pushed the rod in a little bit too much. It's starting to run pretty good right now. I'm starting to move too fast forward. If you noticed how much the molten puddle choked down in width, and then now just too long of an arc. So let's take a look here. This I ran like I would normally run. You can see it's very consistent in width all the way down. The height of it literally stays the same start to finish. This pass, which I only did a partial because I ran out of rod, when I started it, I struck the arc and shoved the rod right in there, which it kind of sputtered for a little bit, and you can see how much this is humped up and how it's narrower than this. Ideally, you want your start to look just like the rest of the weld. Well, you can see clearly narrow, wider. And we're splitting hairs here. I know to you, you might not notice much of a difference, but if we were welding 2/4 inch plates together, this would be like not even fused hardly, and then it would be fine. Well, so I crammed it in there, and about right here, the weld started to get hotter and it wetted out. Then I went too fast while cramming the rod in. Notice how narrow it is in comparison. And then about right here, I long arced it. So I brought it up too high. It started spattering excessively. And you can see how nasty, that looks. And this is, again, where your inconsistency. It's going to be very difficult to produce a weld like this if anything you're doing is inconsistent. And you can see just a couple minor tweaks creates a weld like this versus this. And I mean, let's face it, this isn't really the most pretty weld. I mean, I'm not trying to stack dimes here. I'm just doing a standard little stitch. I can make a lot better or prettier weld than that, but you get what I'm saying, hopefully. Is that just simply a couple little things change makes a drastic difference in how something looks for a weld. And not only that, but the penetration. And you know, this is just a flat plate. This is the easiest thing in the world to weld. You make these little mistakes on a fillet weld or a lap weld and everything is going to be amplified at how bad it looks, or you know, the performance of the weld versus the consistency. So I'm going to run a couple more passes here, and we're just going to stare at what's going on there. And I want you to get a better feel for what I'm doing. This weld I just finished up the previous one. So this weld I'm going to slow down after I make it about 1 inch. This is going pretty good, and I'm just going to cram in rod here, and you're going to watch the puddle grow both in length and in width. Anytime that trailing edge of that puddle is like 3-4 times as long as your rod is in diameter, you're running too slow or too high in amperage. So I'm just cramming it in there, and it's going to grow in width as well. Like you can see how wide that puddle's getting now, and you see all that spatter that's starting to get thrown out like big BBs. You don't want that. All right, so on that pass, I did something a little bit different. Since my machine has arc force on it, and it's set at like, I don't know, 30%, so fairly low. It's not set that high, but I was able to cram that rod in there, and I ran things pretty normal, and then I crammed the rod in there, and you can see how much wider this weld looks. One of the hard things when you're learning stick is to understand what is the proper width bead. Well, in the case of using 332 with 6011, the ideal bead width, if I can get this, is about 2 electrode diameters with flux wide. See how those nicely fit in there? That's the bead width you want. You can see here, guess what? Let me take this glove off, make it a little easier on myself, huh? We started off okay, and then, oh man, we're down to like 1. And even here, it's still under. Good? No good. Definitely no good. Now, if you travel too slow and feed too much rod in, you're going to make too wide of a weld. And now, you can see this is I'd say right there is about 2, but when we get down here, I mean, it's overly wide, okay? When you go overly wide, the risk you run is as you're feeding a ton of rod in there, you can wind up getting arc blow. Your molten puddle gets very out of control. Like you probably saw it in a video. The molten puddle, rather than being about twice the length of, so whatever your electrode is wide, it ends up being about like 2 electrodes. And the puddle would be here while I'm welding here per se. Well, in that video, you saw the puddle started lagging like 3 or 4 electrode diameters back from where the leading edge of the puddle. Well, if you have that big of a puddle on thicker steel in this 1/4 inch, like say 1/8 inch material, you're just going to blow a hole because you're putting too much heat in. You know, not to mention, like I said, when you're cramming a ton of rod in there, I find that as that molten puddle gets too big, too out of control, it just promotes arc blow, and it also promotes excessive spatter coming out of that molten pool and likely on your pants and jeans and your Carhartt hoodies like mine. So you kind of just want to feed it just enough to where you can get it to be about like this. I mean, clearly much wider than this. Kind of looks like a worm per se. Now this is more acceptable for what you'd want out of 1/8 inch rod. 1/8 inch rod, this is about the weld you want to be aiming for. This is little guy 332, this is what you should be aiming for. If you're using 532 rods, you'd be a little bit wider than this. Not by a whole lot, but a little bit. So 2 more things I'm going to mention. As you notice the width of this, look at where the heat affected zone is. Now this plate was already heated from these passes, but you can see this is far enough away from here to where the preheat, yeah, it was something, but it wasn't likely hugely significant. And your heat affected zone is way out here. So that's another good indication that your heat input is very high. Now a mild steel, the heat input isn't a big issue, especially with 1/4 inch thick plate. It's not really a concern, but when this is far easier to weld than like 1/8 inch material. And that's why it's good to start with this and then drop in size just so you can get a feel for it. But this is a telltale sign that you're traveling too slow. Your heat affected zone should be up closer to like right here, not over here. The last thing I'll mention, we'll do some more welding, is that if your rod, when you dig into the plate like this, if it sticks and the arc shuts off, your welder probably doesn't have very high arc force. Or if it's adjustable, you didn't adjust it high enough to where it won't stick. And that's why, like, using a better stick welder, a higher end stick welder, will make you a better stick welder. a better welder in general, because it will help you prevent from sticking the rod, and that also helps you dig into the plate and dig through, say, like rust and contaminants better. And I generally run, I'm not exaggerating, when I bring the rod down, I can feel the rod touching the plate. I feel it. If you're running your whole rod and it never touches the plate, your arc gap is probably too long. Like, you want to bring it down in, up a little bit, bring it into the plate where you can feel a little bit of pressure. Like, it's like melting a crayon off on a hot skillet. That's the best way I can describe what this should feel like to you while you're welding. Or like a hot melt glue stick on a hot pan. That's what you want it to feel like. If you're up here in Never Never Land throwing globs of metal at it, it's not going to do you any good. Keep that down there tight. And don't be afraid with this rod, like I said, to let it touch the plate when you bring it close. Now, these welds I all did with 30% arc force, which is probably similar to what your welder is if you don't have adjustable arc force, what it naturally normally is. I upped this to 65%, which is what Miller recommends for 60-11, 60-10. And let's see if the weld pool looks different. So this weld I'm going to run pretty much normal. However, when I push the rod down to the plate, you're probably going to notice that the molten puddle gets longer in length and likely a little bit wider. I'm going to do a couple other minor manipulation changes. But you can see it's kind of putting a little bit more heat in. It's a little bit hard to tell though. The next weld is going to look a lot different. For this weld, I'm going to hold too long of an arc. Now it looks like the arc is really long, but honestly this is only like, I don't know, a millimeter or about a 1/16 of an inch longer than what you normally would want, so just slightly above the plate. All right, so a couple things here. Now, I had a higher arc force setting here. I did cram the rod in a little bit, but my travel speed was a little bit higher than what it was here. Width, see how it's a little bit narrower? Another indication of your travel speed is the height of it. If you look at, you can see the start's cold, a little bit cold, pretty tall, flatter, okay? Not a big deal. So this ran pretty good even though I was cramming a lot of rod in. You can see again, travel speed, too fast, necking down. Take your time. You want it to look like this. Take your time, there's no rush. Let it fill. Now this, I ran too long of an arc. Now, I haven't really cleaned this other than a quick, kind of once over. You can see when you go with too long of an arc, look at the amount of crap in the toes of this weld. That's going to be extremely difficult to remove. I mean, look at this. I can't even pick this out. It's stuck in there. You probably saw in the video, and I was not that far above the plate, just globs of metal was falling out. Now, if you notice here, look, hard spatter, hard spatter. It's hard to tell, but there's a ton of spatter down here. There's spatter on top of the weld, like all over the place. And that weld looks pretty gnarly. Like I would say that that's not acceptable. It looks very much like over here. And yet this, I kept a very consistent arc gap, just too long. And you can see what happens. Now 6011 functions in what they call a globular transfer, which it's basically like balls of molten metal fall off the tip of the rod into the molten metal on the plate. Well, when you give those balls a fair amount of room to drop in, they're going to hit that molten puddle and splatter out of there. Not to mention, as you bring this rod off this plate, every like half a millimeter adds more voltage, and more voltage means more heat input, which then makes more of the tip of the rod melt off, and it increases the heat, which you want to keep your arc gap tight, because the longer the arc is, like I said, the further the balls, molten balls are going to fall, the more the heat is in the arc area. You want to keep it under control. Hopefully that was clear on this as far as the long arc. And you can see the difference. Like, you look at this, there's a little bit of spatter around here. I mean, I picked up a little bit too much speed here by the look of it, but there's a little bit of spatter here. And then, like even this, where I was feeding too much rod in, but I had a tight arc, and I was going slow, not a whole lot of spatter. And then you come here, and this is really the only weld you see spatter in the weld. Now let me clean this a little bit better, and let's do a final look on that. I could sit here all day and try and pick this slag out of here, and good luck. It's just not gonna come out. You know, this, I mean, I barely did a little bit there, and it's already quite a bit cleaner. I didn't even touch that side much better. So keep that arc in there. You don't want this. I was only floating, you know. I'll give you a side profile if I can get this to focus. I was floating, so this is touching the plate. I was up here. That's it. That's too much. You can bring it down and then up like that, but then bring it down. That's what you want to do. You touch the rod to the plate when you're running it that close. Don't maintain this arc gap all the way down. This is what you're going to get. Not good. All right, let's go on. So this weld I'm just going to run straight in with no manipulation to show that you can do that with 6011. 6011 actually runs okay doing it. 6010, it's less so. You really kind of need to manipulate it a little bit. So for that weld, I literally ran just straight in, no oscillation, and I kept the rod tip touching that plate to where it felt like I was melting a crayon off, and not only that, I could feel the metal in front of the rod like melting off. Like you can just feel like a little bit of pressure that's trying to keep you from progressing forward. I just felt that kind of melt into the puddle. If you look here, sucker's still pretty hot. Very little slag on the toes. I didn't even really hit this with a chipping hammer, I just brushed it. Unlike this, where we still have a ton in there. Look how inconsistent, like you don't necessarily have to manipulate it with 6011. 6010 runs a lot better if you do, but 6011 you can definitely drag it. Now, you can see it's a little bit narrower than when you manipulate it, and that simply is because when you long arc it slightly, the weld gets pushed out flatter, okay? So just a straight drag angle will produce a slightly more crowned up weld, but you can see, I mean, this sucker's still pretty flat for what it is. And again, when everything runs good, even with a straight drag angle, very clean toes. The other thing is, look at the line here. The heat affected zone is so much closer to the weld. If you recall up here, I mean, look where it is. It's all the way here versus here. If you can stack more than one weld between the edge of the heat affected zone and the bead you just put down, you're probably running too hot. And it really doesn't matter what thickness of metal you're running. Like this is, I would say, acceptable. If you're like this, where it's all the way out here, I mean, that's starting to get pretty ridiculous if you're using 332 or even 1/8 inch rods. Again, that's, you know, 1/4 inch, I don't know, 3/8 inch steel and under. That's what you want to aim for. All right, so I think I covered this in enough detail to where you guys can understand and troubleshoot your own welds. And just to go over it again, 2-pass, good. This is looking pretty good. This kind of inconsistent, got issues there, spatter. This too slow, too much rod, trying to deposit too much metal, not good, but it's acceptable, I guess. This here, got a little bit of a cold start, somewhat consistent, not looking too bad, could be better, but decent. This, everything is inconsistent, too long of an arc. And then this guy, pretty consistent for what it is, not looking too bad. Now that we're all on the same page, I'll do an actual weld where we weld something together. I'll do something like an outside corner joint just to help you guys out. And then we'll go to the overview and finish this video up. All right, so I have just a standard outside corner, 1/4 inch thick steel. You're gonna have probably a harder time to weld this, I would say, than a fillet weld, simply because, especially with this little 3/32 rod, there's a lot of metal you have to deposit to get this a nice round profile. And realistically, this is too small of a rod to be doing this. And that's kind of why I brought up earlier in the video that if you're welding on 1/4 inch or even 3/16 plate, you really want to be using 1/8 inch rods. It makes your life a lot easier. Like, these little rods are much, much harder to run because you have to feed so much rod in to fill this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run 2 different styles on this. So the first half, I'm going to feed it in and kind of just do like a circling motion while I'm feeding. I'm going to watch as that molten pool rises in height, and I want to see the edge of this plate kind of get like broke down. So what you'll see is you're going to see the edge, and it's going to sink a little bit, where you can see like the weld is reaching and burning through that edge and sinking down on the outside a little bit. I'm going to try and do it. It's been a long time since I did something like this with 6011. With 6010, I know I can, but with this guy, I may misinterpret some of what I'm seeing from the puddle and may misjudge it. Hey, happens to all of us. But I'm going to try and do that and get a nice, like, rounded profile to the best of my ability on the first half. The second part of this, I'm just going to run a single pass in, wire wheel it, and then I'm going to cap it with sort of like a weave type pattern. Maybe a circle, we'll see. I'm going to base it on what I see in the puddle as far as what I'm going to do. But 2 distinctly different ways, so a 2-pass as well as a single pass. Keep in mind, if I was using 1/8 inch rod, this would be by far easier. So it does pay to use a proper size rod for what you're doing. I'm going to have to burn off like a whole rod just to get it halfway because of how much metal I need to deposit. All right, let's do it. So in this first pass, I'm just going to do a circle movement, and I'm really feeding a lot of rod into that molten puddle. I don't really make it much over 2 inches before the whole rod is gone. In the second part here, I'm just running straight in as a root pass all the way to the end, and then I'm going to cap it by doing a weave. This is a little hard to see, but I'm just going to weave left and right to help fill it up to the edge. All right, so let's wrap this video up. You can see here is a single pass, definitely flatter. When I did 2 passes, I had the root and then I cleaned it out and then ran another pass, and I more or less just weaved back and forth slightly. There's still a fair amount of slag on the toes there, same thing right there. I don't really see any undercut or anything. It's pretty hard in a single pass to fill that much metal with a little 332 rod without having like underfill. I really was cramming this sucker in there and kind of swirling it around, watching to make sure that that edge would fill up with molten metal, but pretty difficult to do with a camera in your face. This is about what you'd want to be aiming for with 6011. If I had to pick between the two, I'd rather do the 2 pass. And the reason is that, well, for one, it's easier. The rod goes further. I mean, this rod right here, I burned up almost a whole rod to go there. Like 2.25 inches, a whole rod. Like if I only had little rods, definitely would do the multi-pass instead. I didn't look. I'm going to take a look. Yeah, I can't really see in there. It looks to me like the penetration is a little bit better with this than it is here, which would make sense because I ran the rod right down the middle. So if any of the 2 welds will have more penetration, it'll be this one. Both are acceptable, and you can do both depending on what the situation warrants. Now you can see there's some hard spatter down there and a little bit here, not really too bad. Honestly, I gotta say this 6011, I don't really have any problems with this rod, to be honest. I got a 7014 video with viewer submission request that I actually already shot, and it'll be out in a couple days. That rod in particular, man, I ran it uphill and all sorts of stuff, and I'm not a really big fan of that. That's probably, I like 6011 far better than 7014. So yeah, there you have it. As you saw in the video, it pretty much comes down to consistency. Like, don't be afraid to touch the rod to the plate. Keep that arc gap tight. Be consistent. Work on that. And it just takes time. Like, you're not going to get really good with 6011 overnight. You know, it takes, give it a, 20 pounds of rods. You'll be a better welder for it, trust me. Anyways, thanks for sticking around for the video. I appreciate it. If you got any comments, questions, you know where to leave them. Thanks.